The night is at its peak. The moon is peeking out from beyond Earth's shadow, creating a bright white sliver. It could be thought of as God's smile as he looks upon his creations. Or maybe it's the devil that he looks upon our suffering. Who's to say? The pale light peeks through the curtains into the small bedroom occupied by Charles Bradley. It doesn't make it far into the room, just creating a slight glow around the covering windows, as if it was a doorway to the eternal plane. A soft green light paints his room as he stares at the ceiling. He shifts gently from side to side, eventually turning towards the source of the light. He squints at the neon numbers pointed at him. Shit, it's already 3 a.m. He says this to nobody in particular. The voice that escapes his throat is gravelly and tired. He slowly sits up in his ruffled covers and stretches his neck from side to side, eliciting a pop as he tilts his head to the right. Charles exits his bed and heads towards the door, connecting his bedroom to his main living space. As he opens his door, he has to shield the opening from a cunning intruder with his shin. He feels a soft bump to his leg, and he exits the room, and hears a loud chortle as a response to the block. He bends down to pick up his black critter and lifts it to his eye level. "Hey bud, did you miss me?" The cat meowed softly and pressed his face against his. A gentle rumble is produced from his chest as the pet purrs in Donor's arms. Charles shuts the door and brings his cat to the couch and sits down while holding his furry companion. The room is dim. The pale moonlight is desaturating the walls and items strewn about the living room, making everything look various shades of silver. The only source of light in the room comes from the blinking light from the internet router. The bright blue illuminates the room, flickering off regularly to show the sliver of the moonlight. The way the different lights create different shadows is surreal to Charles, making him think that momentarily that he is in another dimension. He lifts his hands off his purring feline friend to rub his eyes, hoping to increase his tiredness. Well, Frank, another night of not being tired for me. Insomnia. It's a condition that plagues many people. The body needs sleep, and it can be unbelievably frustrating when you don't get any. One of the biggest causes is stress, and in the 21st century, stress is as common as breathing for most people. Life used to be simpler and stress was less common, but the difficulty of living has spiked in recent years. But a self-diagnosis can be faulty, and Charles Bradley doesn't necessarily have insomnia. You should try some tea. Charles puts Frank gingerly beside him on the couch and pats his head. Frank responds with a tired groan, with a hint of discontent from being off his owner's lap, slowly making his way to the kitchen to turn on the kettle as the metal container clicks on and starts heating the water enclosed. Charles turns on the light and opens the cupboard. He makes a slight glance at the sink of dirty dishes, but pushes that out of his mind. You should have rinsed those better. They will smell in the morning. They'll be fine. Charles looked at the dishes once again, with his hand rising to rub his temple, closing his eyes at the soothing relief. Stop that, Chuck. You know better. He turns back to the cupboard and looks at his selection of tea. He scans through the collection and picks up the box of Cherry Sunshine black tea and inspects the box. You'd be an idiot to drink that now. It'll wake your dumbass up more than it already is. Charles stops and puts the box back. He picks a box of chamomile and puts a bag into a mug. He closes the cupboard and rubs his eyes again, letting out a long sigh as he does so. Dear, why don't you add some honey? It will soothe you and enhance the sweetness. Charles goes back into the cupboard and picks up the honey in there, and ponders it momentarily. Doesn't sugar wake you up more? No, I'm not doing this anymore. He puts the honey on the counter with some force. Sweat starts to form on his forehead, dampening his hair slightly. His gaze is fixated on the counter as he takes some deep breaths. A small drop hits the counter, creating a mere whisper of a sound upon contact. He wipes his eyes, creating another sigh as he does so. Please stop. I don't want this. After a few moments of quiet breathing, he regains his composure and walks to the floor-length mirror next to the couch. He looks at himself and rubs his face in an attempt to quiet down his mind. When he wipes his eyes, though, he catches something out of the corner of them, something faint, like a blur. When he turns around, he sees nothing there. But still, he looks. He keeps seeing something in the corner of his vision, but keeps missing it, like an object just out of reach. His heart starts beating quicker as his breathing quickens. Unbeknownst to him, Frank, his cat, is looking in the same spot as his owner. Charles jumps as the kettle clicks off. This scares him, but also makes him chuckle slightly. My tired mind is making me crazy, but... He says this in the direction of his cat companion, who simply tilts his head at his owner. Charles pours the hot, steaming water on top of the paper bag, willed with dried flowers and leaves. As the water is poured onto the bag, the contents inside start to bleed into the water, the yellow slowly spreading through the mug. Before long, there is a pleasant aroma coming from the brewing tea. Without thinking, Charles picks up the honey and starts to pour some into the mug. He stirs it, watching the thick, gooey substance mix in and dissolve into the hot beverage in front of him. He turns the lights off and seats himself back in the blue flashed darkness. He turns the lights off and seats himself back in the blue flashed darkness next to Frank the cat. He holds the mug in his hands, the heat rising through his entire body. You better not be thinking of putting that in your mouth just yet. It'll be like putting your hand in boiling oil. Thanks, I'm not stupid. Could have fooled me. Charles rolled his eyes, blows on the tea, and wafts the scent into his nostrils. It is already soothing his mind and making him feel tired. But he isn't quite there yet. His mind is racing, and he is losing himself into the maelstrom of his thoughts. Before long, he is centered on his worst fear. Schizophrenia runs in the Bradley family. His father developed it, as did his father, and his father before that, with them along with himself. It starts with hearing voices, then responding to them, then to have full-blown hallucinations. Last year, Charles started to develop the first stage. At first, it started with one that would pop in every now and then. He didn't think it would be anything major, just his own thoughts but in a different voice. The voice said what he was already thinking. But then one turned into two, and two turned into three. It was at this point Charles knew he contracted the family disease. At first, he thought it was amusing. He would hear different voices tell him different things, nothing major. Mostly they were looking out for his best interest. Hell, he even gave them names. Dolores was the nurturing woman who tried to take care of him. Clint was the classic crotchety old man who constantly called Charles a dumbass. Emily was his female counterpart, whose opinions matched his own and often beat him to voicing them. Things were going well. He would only hear them a couple times a day. It went on like this for months, and Charles thought that if this was it, then it would be easy. His thoughts on that changed the day he responded to a voice. He was cooking, making an Alfredo sauce. He had prepared all the ingredients, and he had just started sautéing some garlic in butter. Some onion would bring some great flavor into this, you know. Yeah, I know, but I'm really not a big onion guy. As soon as the words escaped his mouth, he knew it was a mistake. It felt like his brain was exploding, that his head would explode. There was an orchestra of noise in his head that blared for what felt like forever. But as soon as it started, it all came together in one concise message. He can hear us. This was the beginning of the madness that kept him up all night. As he finished his tea, he had to keep telling himself to not respond to the voices. One of the last things his father told him was that schizophrenia got worse the more he associated with the voices. Charles couldn't let that happen. He started to tune them out, ignoring any thoughts that wasn't his own. But, just like most things, there are good days and bad days. Right now, this was about a medium, but more on the bad side. As he sipped his tea, he has to keep reminding himself that he shouldn't reply to these voices. That gives them power, right? The more power they had, the worse off his mental state would be. And that was the last thing Charles wanted. But sometimes it was easy to forget the rules and he would respond. He didn't feel worse, but he didn't want to get to that point. Charles finished his tea and headed back to bed, saying goodnight to Frank with a light head pat. He is noticeably tired at this point. He will have a good sleep. He walks by the full-length mirror on his way to the door, paying no minds to it, as he only sees himself in a tired state. He misses the 3 figures standing in the mirror, watching him as he walks to bed. He doesn't see Dolores Carmichael in her favorite blue dress, the healthcare worker with a heart of gold who died from a heart attack. She just wanted Charles to take care of himself properly. He didn't see Clint James wearing his dirty coveralls that he always wore while he was working on cars, wore it every day until one of those cars crushed him. He knows Charles has potential and wants him to strive for better. Lastly, he certainly doesn't see me, Emily Collins. I was a teacher who pushed a kid out of the way of a bus when he didn't look both ways before crossing the road. Better that I got hit rather than him. In another life, Charles and I would have been great together. For what I've seen and what I've felt, I might have been Emily Bradley. I just want him to be happy. Charles isn't crazy. He's gifted. He can hear what we have to say, and maybe he can actually see us. Only if he tries to grow this gift. I hope that one day that can be the case. But I often wonder, why us? Millions of people die every day. So why can he hear us 3? I do hope to figure that out. If I don't, it really is okay. My time has passed. It's Charles' time now. And I just want him to live.
I lived in the South for a time, years ago. It wasn't by choice. I was just an unemployed teen along for the trip with my folks, who were out frequently for work or vacations. I found the place, Georgia, to be pleasant enough. Something I kept saying was that it was like Indiana, but nicer. Something I was comfortable saying given my being born in Indiana, of course. Weather could get a little extreme in either direction, but it was prosperous enough and pretty comfortable. I wasn't terribly outgoing. Not that I had any real social issues, I just didn't have any reason to. I was out of school and on another side of the country from what I was accustomed to. Frankly, there were only so many ways people my age could meet each other beyond employment and online. Regardless, I ended up spending most of my time in my room or my little basement office, where I set up my PC and TV. The latter of which was situated nicely in front of the surprisingly cheap second-hand leather chair that reclined electronically. It was a nice setup. My point being, I was mostly home on my own. Our backyard led to a colossal forest that seemed to teem with pretty abundant wildlife, from squirrels to deer to toads and possums. Even the occasional coyote. Certainly more fauna than I was used to so close to home. That almost makes me laugh now. In those days, I was pressured often by my folks to pursue a job nearby, be it at a local Kroger or something a bit more tailored to what they thought were my stronger skills. I gave a few different places a shot within the first couple of years and spent most of a year in a position that seemed to be fantastic at the time. I had a good opportunity to thrive. Alas, one thing led to another and I was back home, using delivery apps to make spare change and taking care of the house. This included our 2 dogs and 2 cats and the basic task around the place, which I had gotten used to over the years. It was the best way for me to pull my weight until I could track down something better. That was pretty much what things were like for the remainder of my time in the South, ultimately. I guess speaking broadly anyway. It started a couple years and some change into moving. The folks were finally doing it. Big trip to Asia. Riding elephants and getting scammed for a bunch of bananas. Canoeing and shit. Going to be gone for a month. Leaving an emergency credit card and a wad of cash for groceries. To include pet food. Cute, right? I was glad they were taking the time away, in all honesty. I'll concede, I looked forward to it for selfish reasons too, of course. A month to finally kick back and catch up on all those unwanted torrented films I racked up in my tincture of unemployment, munching on Gushers and Crystal Light lemonade water bottles. Maybe even taking a drive and swallowing a plate full of hot wings at a local sports bar. Was meant to be a good month. At first, that's exactly how it went. I kept up with my household task, vacuuming and doing what few dishes I ended up dirtying. Feeding the pups and cats on time every morning and every night. Collecting the mail. Same old, same old. The folks were having a fantastic time in another country, sending late texts updating me on their little excursions. I think it was around night 3 or 4. I was watching whatever I had just downloaded at the time on the couch in the living room. It was a hell of a lot warmer up there than in the basement, given that it had just become autumn and the basement was pretty unfinished. All I had were a couple of tiny desk fans to produce heat down there. I don't remember or care what time it was, but it was late at night. I'd fed the dogs just a couple hours prior, so when they started setting their soft heads in my lap, I figured it was time to let them squeeze their bladders in the backyard for a bit. I clipped a leash on the younger one. She was potty trained well enough for us, but I couldn't trust her not to run off into the woods at night just for the exercise, and took them out back. It was especially chilly. We had a path of flat rocks back there that we kept clean enough to walk on, but when autumn and winter came along, it was like stepping on whiskey stones. Anyway, I let them piss in the twigs for a few minutes until the bigger one sort of starts chuffing. He'd usually do that when he saw another dog across the street or a delivery person coming up our walkway. Hell, even a squirrel. It was just another indicator that he was nervous about something, so he got protective. The little one's silent, but she's staring into the dark of the woods. At the time, I'm not freaked out or anything. I'm used to them trying to chase local rodents and shit around. I just don't want to deal with it. So, I call the older one back and tell him, "Go home." He hesitates a little, but he listens, as usual. I give the little one a tug with the leash, and finally, we're all back inside. I was just about to sit back down on the couch when the older pup starts chuffing again. I called his name in my stern, corrective tone to tell him to cut it out. But then he starts growling. Back before we moved, he usually growled at the back door when he could tell an animal was approaching our property. I saw him growling at the glass one night and saw nothing until I clicked my flashlight half a minute later and caught a family of possums crossing over our fence. So this told me yes, there was something in the yard, which didn't happen all the time necessarily, but it was enough for me to need to check it out, just to make sure I didn't need to do anything. Back then, I wasn't exactly foolhardy per se, but I felt capable enough to step outside in the dead of night without a knife or anything, which I did. I did bring a flashlight though, which I just clicked and scanned the trees with. I wasn't able to catch any movement, nor did I hear anything until I stood out there for around 20 seconds or so. By this point, I could still hear the dog growling at the door, and the younger one whining, which didn't happen unless she was anxious or scared. Above that, I started to hear a kind of quietish monotone sound. It was less quiet and more like it sounded distant and low. If you asked me back then, I'd have guessed it was some kind of siren. It wasn't unlike the howl of the smoke monster from Lost, oddly enough. After about a minute, it just stopped. I'm not sure if it really trailed off at all, or if the sound was just cut. Frankly, it didn't stay on my mind at all for the rest of that night. I just didn't find anything outside, and went back in satisfied. The dogs were quiet and content, and I resumed my movie. The next day I actually went to a local restaurant to sort of treat myself. I had a good helping of buffalo wings and drove home in time to feed the dogs. When I got to the front door, I expected to see them both anxious, wagging their tails and whining, begging to be fed after a long day. That was the case literally every day without fail. That was not the case this night. I was relieved at first, but then the cause for concern hit me. I still heard them whining. I rushed past the living room and found them at the door to the backyard. This time, they were going crazy. The older one was growling between barks, curling his lips back and staring right into the dark of the woods. The little one was whining between her little barks, which I had only ever heard her do when we tried locking her in a crate when we first got her and had to leave the house. This time, I was nervous. Nervous enough to grab a kitchen knife and keep it with me when I stepped out to take a look again. I stepped off the deck to get closer to the woods this time, scanning the trees with my flashlight again and catching myself breathing through my mouth. Still no sign of any animals on our property. Trees and dead leaves completely still. All I can hear were my dogs losing their shit at the fucking door. Then I heard it again. The distant monotone sound from the previous night cut through the night air. This time though, it had a slightly different... It was crackling, I guess. Kinda like an old radio. And it was louder. I didn't know what the fuck to do. I couldn't track the noise to any direction, and frankly, it didn't sound alive. I didn't associate with anything beyond that's the same sound I heard yesterday. I took a walk around the property. Scared, sure, a bit, but mostly just confused. After a few minutes, I just stepped back inside and fed the dogs. Well, I tried to. At first, they wouldn't pay any attention to their kibble. I couldn't pull them away from the door by any means. They'd just run back when I pulled them. Then, finally the sound stopped, and they noticeably eased. Watched their tension just melt away while they bounced over and inhaled their dinner. I took them outside about a half an hour later. It was even darker then, and I was able to see our breath in the dim backyard spotlight. They started to do their business while I stood there anxious. I didn't bother with a knife that time. I don't think it would have changed anything. Maybe it would have felt worse, telling myself I could have done something differently. I guess that, in itself, wouldn't be any different. The older dog started growling, then barking. I tried silencing him with a stern tone again, but he didn't even notice me. I was about to walk over and grab him by the collar to drag him inside when he took off, sprinting into the darkness and barking viciously. I cried his name again, but fuck, I'll never forget how helpless it felt to hear his barks grow ever more distant in the night. I rushed to bring the little one back inside. She was shivering, scared shitless of something, so I had to pick her up and just about throw her inside without unclipping the leash. Then I took off after the other one. I was just charging through the woods with a flashlight, calling out his name. I could barely hear him barking at whatever he was chasing down. Then, I couldn't. I kept running aimlessly for a good 2 minutes before I even realized it was dead silent. I didn't even have any indication of where our dog had run to. I'm not sure how long I just stood there, freezing in the darkness, in the fucking woods aside from the scalding tears running down my face. I only bothered to call his name one more time before I turned around. I couldn't exactly retrace my steps at this point. I was just shining a flashlight and following the direction I thought was the opposite of where I had run to. And I could remember that distant feeling of helplessness. Fuck it. Fear. I'm not above conceding that. I might have tried to call out our dog's name once or twice more, even if I just knew it was futile, until I just stopped moving. I can't say if I intended to wait until morning came so I could see where the fuck I was, though I expect I wasn't really capable of making a plan at that point. I'd even given up crying. I was just so cold. Christ, it hurt like hell. Fuck me. I remember the sound starting again. Not really starting, more happening. But it was so loud I started shaking. And I think that it was still crackling, but also cracking, like a voice getting unsteady. I think I started moaning. I was too weak to build up a scream or yell or anything in response. Then underneath it all, I heard the rustling of leaves behind me. I swerved around, stumbling and collapsing to the frosty dirt. And when I saw our dog lying there, one of his legs twisted toward his back and his jaw extended far beyond his neck and his fucking stomach opened and steaming in the night. I dropped my flashlight to the side. Only then I was able to summon any strength left to yell. Just sheer horror. Just sheer horror. I could barely hear my own crying underneath the nauseating monotone sound that filled the fucking air. I think that made it all the more terrifying when something that looked like a naked man broke into my flashlight beam and ran toward me, stepping on our dog's corpse and reaching me. I remember 3 things. The sound of our dog's body squishing and crunching underneath the weight of it. I could barely see it, but the way it ran was like a man without a center of balance. Like its legs were the only thing doing any work, even though they stumbled and misstepped. But it didn't stop. I saw a video of AI learning to walk or something that reminded me of it. I don't know. It may have seemingly had a man's body, but it didn't have a head. Just a pair of stag antlers on a lanky neck. If it had a mouth, I either didn't see or couldn't. That's it. I woke up 2 days later, according to the calendar, in the morning. I was lying on my stomach on the flat rock path in our backyard in an uncomfortable position, like I had been discarded. My clothes and feet were dirty, and there were also isopods and shit in my hair. Nothing else. The house was fine. The little pup was fine. She was ecstatic to see me and get fed. I ended up telling my folks that the older one just ran away and I couldn't find him. It was a heartbreaking conversation all around. I could tell there was some resentment. I couldn't blame them. I don't. It destroyed me to watch them post missing dog pictures on all the local Facebook groups. We moved on in time, and away eventually. Nothing has happened since. I haven't spoken of it to anyone. I don't entirely know what I would say. Well, all of this, I guess. I don't know. I don't want to know. I don't want to know what happened to me during that day between the woods and waking up.